This is a conversation about writing displacement, home and identity, and contemporary post-colonial English fiction, a 2016 book by Akram Al-Dick. What happens when identity no longer fits inside a nation, a language, or a homeland? Post-colonial literature repeatedly returns to figures who are displaced, migrants, exiles, refugees, diasporic subjects, people living between histories and between cultures. But displacement is not simply movement from one place to another. It is a transformation of memory, language, belonging, and selfhood itself. The central argument of writing displacement is that displacement should not be understood merely as exile, migration, or homelessness. The text instead proposes displacement as a structural condition of modern post-colonial identity. The book resists two extremes simultaneously. First, it resists rigid nationalism, identities locked into territory, blood, origin, and cultural purity. Second, it resists what it describes as rootless nomadism, a version of identity detached from history, memory, locality, and political struggle. Instead, displacement emerges as an unstable negotiation between memory and movement, belonging in estrangement, continuity, and rupture. This displacement subject is neither fully assimilated nor fully detached. The displacement subject exists in translation. The text develops this argument through post-war, post-colonial literature, especially writers connected to Britain after empire, such as Sam Selvon, Salman Rushdie, Rhys, Hanif Kureishi, Zadie Smith, Monica Ali, Edward Said, and Mahmoud Darwish. Across these writers, displacement repeatedly appears not as a temporary interruption, but as a permanent structure of consciousness. Displacement beyond exile. One of the most important interventions in the text is its refusal to reduce displacement to geography alone. The book argues that displacement is not merely physical relocation. It is a psychic, linguistic, cultural, and historical relocation. This distinction matters because migration discourse is often organized around borders and movement statistics. But literature reveals something different. A person may legally arrive somewhere and still remain displaced. A passport does not resolve estrangement. The author explicitly critiques both nationalism and what he calls nomadology. Nationalism produces rigid identities based on territory and exclusion. Nomadology, by contrast, risks romanticizing movement while erasing historical memory. The text therefore proposes displacement as a middle condition, not rooted purity, not rootless abstraction. Instead, identity becomes historically situated but permanently unfinished. The displaced subject remembers origins without becoming imprisoned by them. This becomes particularly important in post-colonial Britain after World War II. The book identifies two literary generations. First, the Windrush generation. Second, what it calls the masala fish generation. These writers transform English literature itself. Britain is no longer represented as culturally homogeneous. The nation becomes internally fragmented by colonial return. Empire becomes home. Migration destabilizes the fantasy of a pure national identity because the formerly colonized now inhabit the imperial center. This creates anxiety, racism, and nationalist backlash, but it also produces new cultural forms. The book argues that displaced writers altered the literature of England in its language and cultural identity. End quote. This is crucial. Displacement is not represented only as loss, it is also productive. It generates hybrid forms, linguistic reinventions, cultural translations, and new literary identities. But the text repeatedly insists that hybridity should not become an excuse to erase power. Colonial history remains central. Memory remains central. The displaced subject carries history into the present. Section 2. Memory, nostalgia, and the imaginary homeland. The book repeatedly returns to memory, not memory as simple recollection, but memory as a structure which displaced identity survives. Mahmoud Darwish becomes especially important here. Darwish describes memory as a personal museum. That phrase captures something essential in displacement literature. Home increasingly exists through fragments. Smells, images, sounds, objects, corners of cities, textures of language. The homeland becomes reconstructed through sensory memory rather than direct physical presence. The text writes, quote, "Words are the raw materials for building a house. Words are a country." This transforms writing itself into a survival structure. Literature becomes architecture for displaced consciousness. But nostalgia in the text is never romanticized completely. The author distinguishes between memory and nostalgia carefully. Nostalgia emerges after displacement transforms place into imagination. The homeland no longer exists exactly as remembered. Return becomes unstable, possibly impossible. Rushdie describes nostalgia as a broken glass. The metaphor matters because broken glass both reflects and distorts. Memory preserves fragments while simultaneously revealing irreparable rupture. The displaced subject therefore exists between attachment and possibility. Darwish articulates this with remarkable precision. It was air and earth and water, and it turned into a poem. The physical homeland becomes textualized. The lost place survives through literature. This process also destabilizes linear historical time. The past interrupts the present continuously. Displacement therefore becomes temporal as well as spatial. The exile inhabits multiple times simultaneously. Past and present overlap. Memory functions almost like a second geography layered over contemporary reality. The text calls this contrapuntal identity formation. Experiences do not accumulate neatly, they interact, conflict, overlap, contradict. This is why the author rejects fixed cultural identity. Identity is produced through negotiation, substitution, projection, and displacement itself. This self becomes structurally unfinished. Section 3: Palestine, Diaspora, and Permanent Displacement. The discussion of Palestine becomes one of the book's most politically charged sections. Edward Said's distinction between exile and diaspora becomes central. The text argues that the Palestinian condition complicates traditional understandings of diaspora. A classical diaspora often preserves the possibility of eventual return, but Palestinian displacement disrupts this model. The homeland itself has been transformed politically, materially, and geographically. The text writes, return is impossible because the cultural distance created has been too disconnecting to bridge. This produces a condition of repeated displacement, not temporary exile, permanent instability. Darwish expresses this paradox directly. I have come, but I have not arrived. I am here, but I have not returned. This sentence condenses the logic of displacement. Physical presence does not restore historical continuity. The returning exile discovers that both self and homeland have changed irreversibly. The book also examines how Palestinian displacement emerges from another historical return, Zionist return, after Jewish diaspora. This creates a tragic historical inversion. One return produces another exile. The text refuses simplistic symmetry here. Instead, it emphasizes overlapping histories of displacement, colonialism, nationalism, and territorial struggle. Importantly, the discussion is not limited to Palestine alone. Palestinian experience becomes a framework through which the book theorizes displacement more broadly. The displaced subject becomes permanently suspended between locations. Sorry. Neither fully integrated into the present nor fully recoverable through the past. This also explains why the text repeatedly emphasizes the importance of beginnings. Origins matter, memory matters, history matters, but they cannot function as stable foundations anymore. Displacement transforms beginnings into recurring reference points rather than fixed destinations. The homeland becomes mobile, internalized, imagined, and narrated. Section 4: Hybridity, Race, and Post-Colonial Britain. The book then turns towards post-war Britain and the transformation of national identity through migration. Here, the concept of hybridity becomes central. But again, the text treats hybridity carefully, not as fashionable multicultural celebration, not as effortless diversity. Instead, hybridity emerges through racism, exclusion, labor migration, colonial history, and cultural negotiation. Hanif Kureishi's characters illustrate this tension. Karim struggles to locate himself. He is described as the product of multiple histories simultaneously. British class structures, racism, counterculture, colonial inheritance, rootlessness. The text emphasizes that Karim is neither fixed nor detached. He moves freely between his Indianness and Englishness without any fixed centrality. This becomes the condition of post-colonial identity itself. It has no stable synthesis nor ongoing negotiation. Zadie Smith's White Teeth extends this further. The novel insists that immigrants cannot escape history. The past remains active into the present. Smith writes, they cannot escape their history any more than you yourself can lose your shadow. End quote. The metaphor is significant. History is not external. History adheres to the body. Migration, therefore, does not erase historical inheritance. Instead, displacement intensifies awareness of that inheritance. The text also argues that British identity itself changes through migration. Britain can no longer imagine itself as culturally pure or exclusively white. Former colonial subjects reshape metropolitan culture from within. This produces both multicultural transformation and nationalist backlash. The notes section references anti-immigrant politics directly, including Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech and racist nationality legislation protests. Displacement, therefore, becomes inseparable from stale power, borders, citizenship, race, law, or the idea of belonging. The displaced subject exists within structures that continually question legitimacy and belonging. Literature records the psychological effects of this condition. Section 5. Gender, Naming, and Psychological Displacement. The book also insists that displacement operates differently through gender. Rhys and Monica Ali become crucial examples. In the discussion of Rhys, displacement appears as psychological fragmentation produced through colonialism, patriarchy, and renaming. The act of renaming Antoinette as Bertha in Wide Sargasso Sea becomes an act of domination. Naming becomes control. Identity becomes internally imposed. The text explicitly describes renaming as inducing psychological displacement and splitting. Rhys herself becomes emblematic of in-between identity, neither fully Caribbean nor English, neither fully accented nor fully located. Her writing repeatedly stages alienation, disorientation, and melancholia. Displacement here is not abstract theory, it is embodied vulnerability. Monica Ali's Brick Lane develops similar tensions differently. Nazanin initially exists within structures of silence and patriarchal authority, but displacement also creates the possibility of transformation. The text emphasizes how labor, sexuality, language, and urban experience gradually reconstruct her sense of self. One line becomes especially important. The world is changing, and me with it. End quote. This marks displacement not merely as victimhood, but as unstable becoming. Nazneen eventually declares, I will decide what to do. The statement matters because it interrupts predetermined identity. Displacement opens space for self-authorship. But the book never romanticizes this process. Transformation occurs through marginalization, alienation, racism, and labor exploitation. The displaced female subject experiences layered forms of exclusion simultaneously. Colonialism inserts Colonialism intersects with patriarchy. Migration intersects with gendered vulnerability. The result is not liberation alone, but contradiction. Throughout the text, displacement repeatedly produces fractured ev- but inventive identities. Writing Displacement argues that displacement is not peripheral to modern identity, it is central to it. The displaced subject reveals contradictions already present inside nationalism, citizenship, colonial history, and cultural identity. The book rejects fantasies of purity and fantasies of rootlessness alike. Instead, it presents identity as historically burdened, mobile, contradictory, and most of all, unfinished. Memory remains active, history remains unresolved, beginnings remain important even when return becomes impossible. The displaced subject therefore lives within simultaneous conditions: attachment and estrangement, memory and reinvention, loss and production. The text ultimately treats displacement not simply as movement across geography, but as an enduring condition of post-colonial modernity itself. If you found this analysis useful, consider subscribing for more long-form lectures on post-colonial theory, literature, migration, architecture, and cultural history. Thanks.